Welcome to the Yoga Therapy Hour. My name is Amy Wheeler, and I am your host. Today, we're going to do a solo episode with me, and we're still going deeply into the 8 limbs of yoga this year. And as I've told you many times recently, I love these solo episodes because they really give me a chance to go deep and do some research and really talk about the things that matter to me. Most of what matters to me are the questions that our students bring back to us. I feel like it's such a beautiful feedback loop when you're teaching and you see where the gaps are, and then you come back and you kind of realize, oh, there's a gap there. We need to fill that gap and teach our students. So the gap that happened this past week is that I had the wonderful Per Erez come to one of our classes and teach us. And he was teaching about Āsana somatics, specifically the type of somatics that combines with yoga. And afterwards, the students loved it. They thought what he was teaching was so amazing. And one of them said, but is that in our scope of practice as yoga therapists to teach somatics? And I basically said, look, you can't call yourself a somatics therapist or a Āsana somatics therapist unless you've been trained as that. But much of what we do as yoga therapists is somatic in nature. And getting people to have more interoceptive awareness and start to feel their bodies and start to connect in a way that's more about their lived experience from the inside out. And so this took me on a deep dive, thank you to the students, of wow, we need to go back and really follow these threads. And today's episode is all about asana. And specifically, I should say asana, because the A has a line over it, which means it's a long A. So asana. You all know that I'm kind of on this kick where I want us to learn at least how to say the basics of Sanskrit words if we're going to be yoga therapists. So asana. So the root of asana is AS, long AS, which means to sit, to abide, to dwell, to remain established. So already that's a little bit different than this modern postural calisthenics class that most of us came to yoga. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That got us here. We love our vinyasa flow yoga classes. But if you really look at the word, it means to sit, to abide, to dwell, to remain established. So the original Sanskrit meaning of asana was just to have a place to sit, a posture to sit in, a stable posture where you could have some comfort and some ease. We know from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, we talk about that sthiram sukham. That was originally meant like for the posture of sitting, probably cross-legged, didn't really have chairs back then, and sitting in a way that would allow you to do pranayama and then meditation. So originally, this idea of all these postures to stretch and strengthen and build interoceptive awareness, they weren't even there. In early yogic traditions, asana was primarily viewed as just saying, hey, you need to sit up straight, you need to feel comfortable. And it's from this stillness that you can practice meditation, contemplation, or other kind of spiritual disciplines. If we go all the way back to some of the earliest texts that talk about asana, you can go all the way back to Vedic literature. And again, even in the Vedas, it means a seat, a throne, a place to sit during the ritual. So you might have a fire ritual where you're giving things to the fire, you're chanting mantra, you're praying for something, and you're going to sit in a position to be able to do those rituals. In the ancient Vedic texts, they didn't have like a systematic discussion of which asanas and how you're supposed to do them or anything like that. And then we also can go all the way back to the Upanishads. And there's several Upanishads that also mention asana. And again, these are all about the meditative seated position. They recommend that you keep the body upright, you keep a steady position, and you maintain your attention on the spiritual practice or ritual. So again, asana was not about physical training. It was about ritual and meditation. Now, the most famous kind of classical definition of asana appears in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Again, I already said it, Yoga Sutra, chapter 2, verse 46. It's a very short sutra. Sthiram Sukham Asanam. And the most common translation is sitting in a posture that's steady and comfortable. Steady meaning sthira, sukham meaning comfortable. And so Patanjali devotes a couple of sutras to asana out of the whole book, 4 chapters, over 190 sutras. There are 3 sutras that talk about asana. 246 says sit in a steady and comfortable position. 247, the next one, says have a relaxed effort in your meditation on the infinite. Have a relaxed effort doing a meditation on the infinite. So you're still sitting in asana, but you're relaxed and you're meditating on the infinite. And then in Yoga Sutra 248, it says, allow you to be free from the polar opposites of life. Like you can handle all the challenges of life because you've been meditating on the infinite in this very steady, calm, alert, comfortable position. But again, Patanjali never says, hey, there's a list of postures. It's still just sitting, literally, maybe with legs crossed, or now we would do it in a chair for some of us. So just to say that in classical yoga, all of which I've just described, the purpose of asana was for sitting in pranayama, meditation, and possibly going into some states of samadhi. Now, if you're listening right now, you're like, wait a minute, this is the yoga therapy hour. What does this have to do with yoga therapy? I promise you, we will get there. I will promise you, we will get to the scope of practice for yoga therapy and therapeutic yoga. But let's continue with the history. This is important. So around the same period of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, you've got the Buddhist and the Jains, and they also describe asana in these kind of seated positions. They give a little bit more instruction now. They say, sit cross-legged, maybe even in lotus posture, have a stable meditation seat, and begin your contemplative practice. So the first time we start to see a shift in the history of this word asana is kind of in what some people call medieval hatha yoga. And this was when hatha, the sun and the moon, right? The two opposites, hatha yoga, is coming into being and on the rise. And now this is when some of the texts around hatha yoga began to describe specific postures and linking those postures, here we go, yoga therapist, to things like purification, prana regulation, the ability to awaken kundalini, longevity, and spiritual transformation. So, wow, this is mind-blowing. To me, even though we say that yoga therapy has only been around a couple 100 years tops, I actually would like to point to this and say, if these texts back in the 1000 to 1500 CE, if they were talking about using postures for purification, prana regulation, awakening kundalini, longevity, and spiritual transformation, I think we have the basis of yoga therapy right there. So I just want to go through a couple of those texts and kind of tell you what postures they even talked about. So if we look at something like the 15th century Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is one of the most influential Hatha texts, it describes about 15 asanas. And, once you see what these are, you're like, oh, that's interesting. Siddhasana, Padmasana, Simhasana. These are basically all different ways to sit with your legs crossed, right? Maybe you could sit on your shins, with your buttocks on your heels, that kind of thing. But basically, it's just listing all these different ways to sit. And that it's through these seated postures that you can start to purify, regulate prana, awaken kundalini, and have more longevity. You might think, well, how does sitting with your legs crossed do that? Well, there's a lot going on when you're sitting with your legs crossed. You're doing pranayama practices, which of course are going to be purifying and regulating the prana and awakening the kundalini. You're doing meditation practices. You're probably doing mantra, this type of thing. So all of the more subtle tools and technologies of yoga were being done while in the seated position. So I kind of want to go through a little bit more of some of these hatha yoga texts and what are some of the other postures they talked about. So there's another one that is called the Ghiranda Saṃhitā, and that's Gheranda, Ghiranda Saṃhitā, Samhita, if you want to go look this up. These are kind of the more famous ones. And in this text, it says that there's 8.4 million asanas corresponding to the 8.4 million life forms through which consciousness evolves. Wow, that's amazing. What could we do with our bodies, right? And of these 8.4 million asanas, Shiva is said to have taught 84 principal asanas, and that the Ghiranda selected 32 as being particularly beneficial for humans, which I find hilarious because did we ever think that some of those 8.4 million asanas could be for bugs or dogs or cats? That didn't occur to me until I realized, oh, okay, there's 32 that are particularly beneficial for humans. So I'm going to tell you what a few of them are. You can go look up the list of 32 on your own. That's why I spelled out the name of the text for you if you're interested. But things, again, like Siddhasana, which is basically sitting with your legs crossed in a special way. Padmasana, same. Vajrasana, which is, again, sitting on your shins with your buttocks on your heels. Simhasana, lion pose. Gomukhasana, some of you know Gomukhasana, cow face pose. Virasana, hero pose. And then they get into some interesting ones. Dhanurasana, bow pose. Matsyasana, fish pose. Matsyendrasana, lord of the fish pose, but it's kind of like a seated twist. Paschimottanasana, which is a seated forward bend. Utkatasana, which is a full squat. Mayurasana, which is like elbow stand, standing on your forearms. Vriksasana, which is tree pose. Shalabhasana, locust pose. Ustrasana, camel pose. Bhujangasana, cobra pose. You get the idea. It looks like a lot of straight spine poses and some forward bends and back bends, and I guess a few twists. So when you look at this list, many of these kind of look familiar to us, right? I just read a bunch of them. And so this list is basically kind of the basis for what a lot of us do when we teach maybe an asana class today. But you'll notice a lot of these are seated or on your knees. There aren't a lot of standing poses. So seated on your knees, maybe on your belly, maybe on your back. So the majority of the list consists of these seated postures. And again, that reflects the medieval hatha yoga emphasis on meditation, mudra, mantra, pranayama, and kundalini practices, rather than kind of like these flow sequences that we see today. So already you're kind of getting into this idea of, well, what is the scope of practice for yoga therapy when it comes to asana? And I think my point was sharing all of this with you. My student was asking me, is look, we're kind of making this up as we go along. The fact that we say warrior one counts as being in scope of practice, but this other thing doesn't count, somatics doesn't count. It's kind of a very gray line. Like, who's deciding that? Why do we get to say where one is in scope of practice, but doing a somatic exercise is out of scope of practice. And I am going to have this come back all the way around at the end, I promise you. So let's summarize this little segment and just say that with the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the Kiranda Samhita, these are both texts that place a greater importance on asana for stability, maybe a little strength, being able to sit up nice and straight so that you can do pranayama for purification. You can add in some mudras and some bandhas to direct your prana with the ultimate goal of being in meditation or samadhi, maybe one day. And so therefore, from a historical perspective, asana, one of the 8 limbs of yoga, but also mentioned in these other texts, was always considered preparation for the deeper limbs of practice rather than the primary practice itself, which is what we tend to do. We want to do an hour of asana and a 4-minute, lie down and rest and hope you don't fall asleep at the end. And so this is one of the reasons that many scholars and traditional teachers note that modern postural yoga represents a significant kind of deviation. Some would say expansion. I would say deviation, kind of beyond the role of asana, and that we know from the classical and medieval texts. So already, I think this idea of what's in scope for a yoga therapist teaching asana and what's out, it's already getting a little shaky. All right, so there's another text that we kind of refer to in the historical sense of asana, and it is called the Śiva Saṃhitā. And basically, this one describes 84 important asanas. But again, they come back to these seated asanas like Siddhasana, Padmasana. So we can memorize all these lists, or we can look at what was the function that they were trying to accomplish. And so what we know now is that the Śiva Saṃhitā is mostly concerned with the nadis, the energy channels, the subtle energy channels, with how to keep them clean so that the prana can flow, the kundalini can do what it does, that we can sit comfortably to focus our minds on the mudras, the bandhas, the meditation, and eventually the non-dualism of your own body and realizing you are liberated, you are one with the universe. And so the underlying assumption with all of this is that the practitioner can sit comfortably so that they can do this more transformative work involving the regulation of prana and refining consciousness. So, that's a lot. Just to clarify, the Yoga Sutra talked about 3 sutras that deal with asana, and none of them are modern postural yoga. The Śiva Saṃhitā talked about 4 principal asanas, Hatha Yoga Pradipika about 15, Kiranda Samhita about 32, and all of it was to prepare you for pranayama and meditation. How did we get to modern yoga and asana? That is the next question. Because clearly the history is not suggesting that vinyasa flow to music is where it's at. I think one thing I'd like to also say before we go on is that when we get into a text like the Śiva Saṃhitā, we're kind of moving over into this more tantric cosmology. And I want to say what about the Śiva Saṃhitā makes it tantric so that you can see where we've ended up at the end of this long story. So what makes the Śiva Saṃhitā and the list of asanas more tantric is that now we're starting to see your body as a sacred microcosm. Classical yoga often emphasizes this transcendence and de-identification with your body. And so what the Śiva Saṃhitā is telling us is that the entire universe exists within you, within your body. that your body isn't an obstacle of liberation, but it's a sacred vehicle through which realization occurs. And that's a very deeply tantric idea. And so that's like a new thing. Now we're getting closer to yoga therapy, right? Now we're getting closer to this idea that we're coming into the body. We're not transcending the body. We're coming in and we're starting to feel and we're starting to be, right? I'm going to take just a couple of minutes away from this episode to tell you about our Masters of Science in Yoga Therapy at Notre Dame of Maryland School of Integrative Health. Hi, I'm Amy Wheeler, and I am the department chair. And I am so proud of what is developing at Notre Dame of Maryland in this Masters of Science program. It is the only Masters of Science at an accredited university in the nation, and we're doing such great clinical work. We find that because of the clinical setting, the electronic medical records, and the training that we can give through a university setting, that our graduates are finding jobs out there in the field of yoga and yoga therapy. With a master's degree, in addition to your certified yoga therapist designation, I think you'll find that it's much easier to find work. We would love to talk to you more. We have one open house per month. If you email me, I can help you find out how to get to the open house and how to get more information. Check out the show notes and let's get you looking into Notre Dame of Maryland's Masters of Science in Yoga Therapy. Thanks so much for listening. Back to the show. And then another kind of key theme in the more tantric texts, and specifically the one we're talking about is Śiva Saṃhitā, is that the awakening of Kundalini is a primary goal of the practice. And I don't know if I should go into Kundalini. Maybe I need a whole separate podcast on that. But one thing I just want to talk about with respect to Kundalini is that there are different traditions that see it differently. Some traditions see the coil, the Kundalini coil, 3.5 coils of a snake, as the thing that sits at the base of your spine. It's the mala, the blockage. Some see the Kundalini as the thing that is blocking the prana from flowing and enlightenment to happen. And they say, as you start to burn the Kundalini, the snake stands up, basically metaphorically, and the prana can flow. Other people say the Kundalini is the pranic flow of energy up your spine. I don't know if it matters. We don't have to argue about if the Kundalini is the thing that blocks the prana or if the Kundalini is the actual prana. What we know is that there is a Sushumna nadi, the main nadi going up your spine. The prana needs to ascend, and this is going to awaken some spiritual powers. Those are kind of the hallmarks of medieval Tantra. So we don't have to argue over if Kundalini is the block or it's actually the energetic bursts. Let's just say we want the prana to flow. So in doing that, now we're getting closer to this idea of purification around my mental habits, my emotions, my negativity, things that are distracting me, my physical body distracting me, right? That in order for the prana to flow, we need to basically clean some things out, which again is getting us a little bit closer to yoga therapy, that we are cleansing the body, mind, and spirit so that prana can flow a little bit more easily. All right. So another idea that's very tantric in nature that has to do with asana and the text that we're talking about today, which again is the Śiva Saṃhitā, is there is this idea that we can have liberation through our body. We don't have to go out there to find God or liberation. It's actually inside of us. And so while many of the aesthetic traditions earlier kind of viewed the body as something to overcome or escape from, the Śiva Saṃhitā basically taught that liberation can occur through regulation of breath, through energy management, through embodiment, and through these internal practices. And this is really distinctly a tantric orientation or non-dualism. Everything is one. Again, that's getting us a little bit closer to the idea of embodiment, interoception, somatics that so many of us have started to look at as a framework for the asana that we use in yoga therapy. So again, the Śiva Saṃhitā teaches that liberation can occur through your breath, through your energy management, embodiment, and these internal practices. Another really cool thing that the Śiva Saṃhitā repeatedly stated was that yoga can finally, for some of the first times, not be done by the forest dwellers, but done by the householders. And this is really important because, again, this is where yoga therapy and therapeutic yoga come in, that this contribution to Indian spirituality, that enlightenment is even possible in this ordinary life, and that we don't have to be renunciates. Again, wow, these are new ideas. So, even though this Śiva Saṃhitā is usually classified as kind of a hatha yoga text, it really does sit at the intersection of Tantra and opens us up to asana as something very different. Not just sitting, but wow, we can be embodied. We can start to feel and sense and have wisdom or knowledge through our bodies. That's a whole new idea. All right. We haven't really gotten into the chakras. I'm not going to go there today, but that could also be something that we could talk about. Maybe another one. I can't do it all at once. So just to kind of summarize here, for anyone studying the history of asana, just know that the Śiva Saṃhitā is one of the clearest examples of medieval hatha yoga becoming infused with tantric concepts. And it's kind of representing a shift away from the more psychological model that we found in Patanjali, what we call Raja yoga, yoga of the mind, yoga of meditation. And now we're moving more towards energetic embodiment model, which is that the transformation occurs through working skillfully with the pranic body, the subtle body. And this is the reason that many of our modern discussions around chakras and kundalini and nadis and subtle anatomy trace back to texts like the Śiva Saṃhitā more than the Yoga Sutra. Both are important. I think of Yoga Sutra as the top down, the Śiva Saṃhitā as the bottom up, if you will. All right. So, are you with me? We're working it today. Let's look at this idea of somatic approaches that so many of us are using in the field of yoga therapy. This was the original question for my student. Wait a minute, I know these classical yoga postures and I know they're in scope of practice, but can I just jump over and do somatic type stuff? And is that okay? Here's the crux of the issue is that they both arise from very different philosophical foundations. The modern kind of somatic approach of embodiment and feeling and sensing versus the classical hatha yoga and using yoga for pranayama and meditation and enlightenment. But let's look at where they overlap. Where they overlap, and this is the crux of yoga therapy, the body, your body is a source of knowledge. So in many Western traditions and ways of being, knowledge is often viewed primarily as a head thing. You can think your way through it. And now through the somatic orientation, we're starting to think, oh, your body actually has wisdom to tell you. Your body has intelligence. It's not just all thoughts. Because the Śiva Saṃhitā said the body is a sacred microcosm and prana can be experienced directly. You can feel when prana is flowing or when it's shut down or when it's blocked. And it's through this awareness of our internal sensations that can lead to transformation. A whole new path, right? And in the modern somatics approach, we're talking about interoception as a way to get in touch with and reveal physiological states. What's happening in my heart rate? Oh my gosh, it's going up. How come my muscles feel so tight? How come my face feels like I have a mask on? That through feeling and sensing our bodies, we can start to understand what's going on inside of us, and that these bodily sensations often are better at providing us information before we even have a conscious thought. Like, we're not even aware how stressed out we are, but our bodies are telling us. And that we can actually regulate our physiology through this bottom-up approach without thinking our way through everything. So, both the Śiva Saṃhitā, body as a sacred microcosm, and modern somatic movements, they both encourage internal listening to what's going on inside of you. Kind of a second area that they kind of come together is the internal experience that you're having when you're doing asana or somatics is more important in that moment than the external form. So we're not even looking at, is your arm straight? Is your leg straight? Are you doing this pose perfectly? How do you look to everyone in the room? Neither the Śiva Saṃhitā or somatics cares about that. It's not about how you look or your appearance. Instead, they're both asking, what are you feeling internally? Is your breath changing? Is your state changing? And so this is why so many yoga therapists and therapeutic yoga teachers are kind of increasingly emphasizing interoception over perfect alignment. Another place that we see Śiva Saṃhitā as well as somatics kind of in agreement is that there's emphasis placed on breath work in the Śiva Saṃhitā, on directing prana and balancing the internal energies, versus the modern somatic approach is focusing on regulation of respiration, your vagus nerve, resetting it, autonomic nervous system regulation, heart rate variability. But really, those are, I wouldn't say they're the same, but they're both looking at the same systems in the body. It's just that when we place emphasis on pranayama, directing prana, and balancing internal energies, it's a much more subtle form of regulation of your respiration, your vagus nerve, and your autonomic nervous system. By the time that it's gotten to your breath and your vagal tone and your heart rate variability, it's much more concrete than it was when you were balancing and directing the prana and the internal energies. One could even say that we can't measure prana and internal energies. We don't have the tools to measure it, but that was the more subtle manifestation before it grew into something that we can actually measure. Heart rate variability, nervous system regulation, vagal tone. And I would even say we're not even very good at measuring those things yet. But I love that idea that the prana preceded these more gross or tangible ways of kind of seeing if we're okay in our own bodies. Another area that the Śiva Saṃhitā and modern somatic movements kind of come together is they both agree that transformation occurs through direct experience. Both traditions are experiential. You can't read about them. You can't be lectured about them. You actually have to go inward and feel them and experience them. So to tell people that the knowledge that your body is giving you is important and that you need to feel it. And if you're numb, if you're in shutdown, if you can't feel sensation anymore, that it's important to come back home to your body, to feel safe in your body, to understand what it feels like to be hungry or thirsty or have to go to the bathroom, to understand pain when it's a little pain signal before it gets to a big pain signal. These are all things that yoga therapy is very, very interested in. So in the yoga therapy tradition, and I would even argue the somatics traditions, we're really looking to cultivate a felt sense, an internal awareness. How does my body feel today? And turning that into very important knowledge. Now, I was talking to some other students this morning, and I'll just add this in quickly, that some of you are hyper aware of your internal experiences and subtle prana and subtle nervous system regulation. Others of you are hypo, meaning you don't feel much at all, you and your clients. So figuring out when do we need to realize that being able to feel everything so much is actually an imbalance, and we need to lessen the ability to feel, versus there's some people who can't feel at all, and we need to increase their ability to feel. So I spent an hour and a half with some students this morning just practicing exercises of how do you help people reduce all those internal sensations, or how do you help people feel again. It was a really, really fun class. I loved it that that's where the students took it, that, oh, we have to figure out, is it hyper or hypo? And then what can we do to help people get back to feeling appropriate interoceptive awareness? So just to kind of summarize this, you can see how many wonderful similarities they have. Let's talk a little bit about the differences between the Śiva Saṃhitā and these kind of tantric ideas versus modern somatics, and you could even add modern hatha yoga into that. In the more hatha yoga / tantra connection, prana is real, life force is real, your energy meridians are real. There's literally, maybe 360,000 nadis in your body that prana is moving through. Kundalini is real, and we're trying to get the prana to go up through the Sushumna, and that consciousness is real, and that spirituality and liberation are the ultimate goal. Versus the difference with modern somatics, we're not really going for consciousness or spiritual liberation. We're going for nervous system regulation, controlling the sensory input, hyper, hypo, feeling again, interoceptive awareness. How can I feel what's happening inside of me? Maybe even neurophysiology and psychological well-being. That the goal for somatics is usually health and resilience and trauma resolution and improved function, rather than moksha or liberation. So I think it's important to say that so that we don't strip the yoga from the ground that it grows in. And one thing I would ask all of us as yoga therapists is to not do that, to not just use somatic type movements, call it yoga therapy, help people regulate their nervous system, and never talk about consciousness and prana flow and how to reach liberation. We need to keep the yoga in the context, even if we're using somatic type movements for nervous system regulation, interoception, neurophysiology. That's all great. But let's not forget the goal, which is to help people suffer less and to help them understand there's something much larger than themselves that they can connect with. And we can argue all day long about when it's appropriate to tell people, hey, here's the ultimate goal. Did you know that? We don't have to tell them when they walk in the door, because that's not what they think they're looking for. But we also can't hide it. And this is where I really think we're getting into trouble when we medicalize yoga or yoga therapy and try to plop it into, let's say, a hospital setting and make it more somatic in nature and strip it of the Sanskrit, strip it of the culture, strip it of the history, strip it of all the things that make it unpalatable to people. I don't agree with that. I really don't agree with that. I think we pretty early on need to say, this is about nervous system regulation. This is about feeling better, mental, emotional, psychological, physical well-being. And there's this thing called consciousness that we're also growing within you. And there is a spiritual component. Not everybody agrees with me, but that's just my opinion. All right, so I want to layer in one last thing before I finish today. And when we look at yoga asana, from hatha yoga, from tantra, from classical yoga, from somatics, all of these place significant value on the direct experience of being human. And that is very different than intellectualizing our lives, from thinking our way through our lives. I say that most of my clients are unwell because they're only living from the neck up. they've decided to live from a very intellectual place, and they're not feeling, they're not sensing, and they're actually quite disconnected from their bodies, which is part of what led to getting unwell, because they couldn't sense, when is prana flowing? When is it not flowing? Did I eat in the last 12 hours? How is not getting enough sleep affecting me? So this idea of what it means to be human in a more lived experience is really important. And we can ask questions of our clients like, what does it feel like to be anxious? And what are the sensations that you feel in your body? Can you feel your chest rising and falling with each breath? Do you feel at home in your body? Do you feel safe in your body? Can you put attention on a particular place in your body? Like when you're doing yoga nidra and they go through the 61 points of consciousness, and each point your brain has to like focus on that spot. And also things like, what does it feel to have consciousness inside of you? What does it feel like? So this lived experience is attempting to describe an experience before we cognitively or intellectually explain it. And I was talking to yet another third group this week, and we were kind of, I would say, debating over curriculum. And this person said to me, Amy, how can we possibly do practice before they've learned the theory? We have to like learn the theory before we do the practice. And I said, actually, that's not my preference. Once you learn the theory, everything becomes intellectual and cognitive, and you're thinking your way through the practice. I said, I would much rather start with practice, start with the lived experience, no idea about the theory, feel it, sense it, try it out, and then come back and talk about what that lived experience was like, and then come in with the more cognitive theoretical. And I don't think they liked my answer, but I personally think that as soon as we get an idea intellectually about what it's supposed to be, we have a whole lot of trouble coming from that first person lived experience. So when we are a yoga therapist, a yoga teacher, a therapeutic yoga teacher, we're kind of asking our clients, what do you notice? What do you feel? How is that for you? What does it feel like inside when you lengthen the breath? Do you feel more relaxed? What happens when you sit quietly? Do thoughts rush in? Does your body get in pain? And we're kind of teaching our client or our student to become the observer of themselves. And so this is a big part of what we're doing. I mean, asana obviously can do that. Lying in shavasana, lying down on corpse pose can do that. So one of the reasons it's important to me that this is more of a lived experience, and Patanjali agrees with this, is because I think that's closer to what the people who came before us, how they were living. They were using their hands. They were bending over. They were carrying water. They were feeling their legs go back and forth to the river. They were feeling the heat as they were cooking. They were hugging. They were touching. They weren't looking at screens all day. And I think we're trying to get people to go back to the basics and to start to understand what it means to be human, especially in this time of artificial intelligence, when a supercomputer, AI, can spit out so much cognitive information, so many words, most of which don't make any sense. They're hallucinated word salad. How is that AI bot different from your experience of being human? And this is why yoga therapy, yoga, therapeutic yoga is going to become so important in the age of AI, that basically to be human means to feel and to be in your body and to have this direct experience with all of your senses and to observe what's going on inside of you, what's going on in nature, how do those two things interact, to listen to that deep inner embodied wisdom or the kinesthetic sensations that your body is producing to help give you wisdom and knowledge, and not shutting that down and suppressing it or distracting from it, but saying, whoa, why is my body physiologically acting this way? What's going on here? My body knows something I don't. I promise you, your body knows a lot that you don't know. And I'd like to see us get back to that more lived experience and to ceremony and ritual and listening to our dreams and our visions and our storytelling with one another around the fire and kind of an embodied participation in life. And going back to this idea that knowledge is a lived experience, not just an intellectual experience. So, so many of us say to each other, what do you think? What if we started saying, what have you observed? What have you experienced? What is the land teaching you? What are the cries of the birds teaching you? What is your own anxiety teaching you? Right? And so we're tuning back into the type of knowledge that is embodied. It's not transcendent. It's not outsourced to AI, that you have wisdom inside of you. And that maybe yoga therapy, therapeutic yoga can help us move back towards this more embodied place that the indigenous people place greater emphasis on, the knowledge of our relationship with the land and the ancestors and community and animals and plants and water, and make that as important as the cognitive knowledge. In my opinion, even more important. I think this is really beautiful because it shows us that the work that we are doing is needed now more than ever, especially in this age of technology and AI, that helping people learn to observe and feel and perceive and sense and intuit what could be more important. So I think one of the problems that we have in our field, and, I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to, is that there's not enough paid work. And I need to separate out enough paid work from the value of what we do and just say that throughout all of time and history, people haven't necessarily paid for this work. And maybe they won't pay for it. Maybe this isn't something that can be part of the capitalistic grind of a system. I wonder if it's actually kind of separate from that, which means a lot of us probably have to find day jobs. We have to find other things to pay our bills so that we can do this sacred work. And that's not something that's likely to change. I know that we've had a lot of people critiquing and complaining about our yoga organizations have not done enough to promote XYZ. I'm starting to feel like maybe this indigenous way of being can't be inserted into healthcare, into a medicalized system. I know that's sad for a lot of people. Maybe you don't like that. I know you put a lot of time and energy and love into learning how to be embodied and help other people to be embodied. And throughout all of time in history, that hasn't really been something that has paid a lot of money for people to do. We're more like Reiki or somatics. It's the most important thing in life. That's the really, really strange thing about it. It's the most important thing in life to learn to have that first person lived experience and that embodiment. Nothing could be more important. That's why we're here. And yet, capitalism doesn't reward for that. Surprise, surprise. So with that said, I think we need to commit to this path, commit to doing it as best we can within the spirit of, I also need to provide for myself. How can I do that? How can I provide for myself as well as continue to pass on this sacred work that we do? So that is a long pathway all the way back from where we started today, which is Āsana as contemplation for liberation, all the way into embodiment, all the way to committing to this work now more than ever. And also knowing that maybe capitalism isn't going to reward us for it. My internal feeling is that capitalism doesn't want us embodied. It doesn't want us to feel. It needs us to live from a very cognitive and intellectual place instead of feeling and sensing. That's just my little my little thing that I've been thinking about lately. Like, what could be worse than to have a bunch of people who know who they are, who are observing clearly, who are feeling, who are sensing, who are wanting to be in community, who are wanting to be at one with the land. Like, that's a nightmare for capitalism. And I'll be one of the first ones to say it. Maybe we don't need to be so medicalized. Maybe we don't need to fit into the healthcare structure. And maybe we don't need to depend on capitalism to save us. So that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thank you for being here. It's been such a pleasure. I value your feedback, your thoughts. You can find me on my website, www.theoptimalstate.com. You can email me through my website and let me know if you agree or you disagree. But I hope you've enjoyed this little kind of history of asana. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next week. We have done over 200 episodes and we have had over 200,000 downloads. And we hope that in some small way we have supported you mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. If you'd like to support the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast in 2026, there's several meaningful ways you can do so. First, you can become a member of our Patreon community and donate as little as $5 a month to keep the podcast going. Your contribution helps us to sustain the depth and quality of conversations on the podcast. A second option is that you become an Optimal State mobile app member for both Android and iPhone. Again, this is about $5 a month, and we're going to start providing a lot of amazing content on our mobile app in 2026. We'll definitely want you to be part of that community. We also have a book coming out called Applications of Therapeutic Yoga in Integrative Health. This book will be published by Routledge Publisher. It's written by Amy Wheeler and Marlisa Sullivan. We hope you'll consider purchasing this book. Again, the name is Applications of Therapeutic Yoga in Integrative Health by Wheeler and Sullivan. For those of you who are seeking advanced training in therapeutic yoga or in yoga therapy, please consider checking out the programs at Notre Dame of Maryland School of Integrative Health. We have a MS in yoga therapy, and we also have a postmaster's degree therapeutic yoga for licensed healthcare providers that's starting in the fall of 2026. In addition, we have a comprehensive Ayurveda certificate program also geared towards licensed healthcare providers. Each one of these programs is a pathway designed to support healthcare professionals and yoga teachers and yoga therapists who are ready to integrate these teachings into clinical, education, and community settings. All right, thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast. We wish you a wonderful week. We hope that somehow, in a small way, we've contributed to your well-being so that you can go out and share that well-being with others. That's what life is all about, bringing in the goodness through you and then shining it out to the world. We need you more than ever. So let's all get out there, do good, be good, and have a great week.